is Aparna Bhaskaran from Brandeis University. He's talking about self-limited structures in active fluids. On stage.
Thank you. Right. Thank you, Rahul and Christina, for letting me come to this conference. And thank you all for listening to me. And I want to mention at this point, when I have the chance, is that I've been sitting in the audience and listening to all of the things that you've been doing with a linear combination of joy and jealousy. So it's been going great. Let me begin by telling you what I want to talk about. First, I will start with some philosophical framing that basically tries to define all of the different things that are there in my title. Then I'll try to tell you two stories, one of a microscopic simulation model and one of trying to understand stuff that's happening in experiments. And I want to apologize to the serious people. What do I mean by that? I think you will agree with me that we listen to talks in two moods. One mood is when, like, I have to understand every word coming out of that speaker's mouth. Then what will happen is that if there is insufficient math, you're like, okay, either that person is an idiot or I'm an idiot. That depends on your relationship with that person. In the other mood, when you are in a flaky mood, you're like, oh, they're telling a story. There are nice pictures. There are movies. So let's just listen to it kind of thing. This is a very flaky talk. I hid all of the math. Okay. So let me start with my basic story. Clustering in active systems is where I'm sitting. And in order to at least pay lip service respect to the context in which I'm giving this talk, I want to start with the mathematical underpinnings of clustering in active matter. It's just correlated noise. For example, if I take an active Brownian particle or some other self-propelled particle that moves along some direction of its body axis, the primary feature that gives rise to clustering is if I thought of that self-propelled thing as a noise term, that noise term is going to have exponential correlations. So you can think of kangaroo processes, or you can think about one-step Markov processes, or whatever else you like. If you have correlated noise and then you add the other ingredients of mechanics that are present in physical systems, you get clustering. And what basically has to happen is that the intrinsic time scale, the noise correlation time scale, should be probed by some other phenomenon, some other physics that is there in your system. And when that happens, you get clustering or anti-diffusion or rectification or Rose by any other name. Now, the classic example of this is, why isn't my movie playing? The classic example of this is MIPS. We've heard about it a few times in this conference, and that is the Bible for MIPS, Mike Cates' review. In this case, the correlations in the noise are probed by the collision frequency of the gas. When the collision frequency in the gas becomes comparable to the correlation time in the noise, you get motility-induced phase separation. And this is a very well-characterized phenomenon at this point. And I also want to give one more example from when I was a baby girl, where this experiment from Bob Austin's group, where they put E. coli in a microchannel with wedge-shaped openings between them, and as a function of time, it built up a density gradient with most of the E. coli ending up on one half of the box. And in this case, the anti-diffusion or rectification is happening because the time taken to transit the barrier probes the correlation time, and I effectively get more particles going from the left to the right rather than other way around because of the size of the barrier. So this correlation is the reason why you get anti-diffusion in active matter. And I want to tell one more story of this correlation giving rise to anti-diffusion. This is the story that is relevant for some of the things I will say in my talk, which is, let me put active particles inside a box, let the box be of length size L. Then if the time taken for me to transit the box is short compared to the correlation time in my noise, I'm just going to run in a straight line and end up at the wall and stay at the wall. So I will get clustering at the wall the moment I put active matter inside a box. And one feature of this thing when the wall is curved is that when an active particle runs into a wall, the nu hat in this picture is the orientation of the self-propulsion speed of the active particle. N hat is the normal to the surface. then a particle that is located this way will now move parallel to the wall, because the equal and opposite reaction force from the wall will cancel the normal component of the velocity. You will move parallel to the wall, and you will move until such time as the self-propulsion direction coincides with the local normal of your curved surface. Now, this is just mechanics. I'm not saying anything. And the only other feature to add to this is to say that if I have regions of high curvature, I can accommodate more particles there than in regions of low curvature. So the density turns out to be proportional to the local radius of curvature of the wall, and you can do simulations and so on and see that you get density accumulations at regions of high density. This is a well-known old result. There are a number of papers that have studied various aspects of this phenomenon, and we know a lot about this phenomenon. But I'm going to use particular features of that phenomenon for the story I want to tell you. But the story I want to tell you is I want to ask myself a snooty physics question, which is, can I form self-limited structures in active matter? And what are self-limited structures? Self-limited structures are structures that have the same number of particles or the same size, irrespective of how many particles are there in the bath, right? So I want structures that do not scale as I change the density, it becomes bigger. If I have phenomena that are coarsening, phenomena that are phase separating, then my object is going to be as many particles as there are in my box. So I want to be able to make self-limited structures. This language I got from my buddies Mike Hagan and Greg Grayson, and if anybody is interested in equilibrium self-assembly, this is a very nice paper that this is what they spent COVID lockdown doing. The most promising route for self-limited structures in active matter is arrested phase separation. So you arrest phase separation at a length scale that you can control, then you can get self-limited structures. This is a well-developed field that I'm not going to talk about, so I will point to Mike and Cesare in the audience if you want to know more about this. And there is a large body of work where the pretty field theories that Mike Cates has written down have been, you look for implementations, ways to implement them in microscopic models. People have played with logistic growth, reaction diffusion systems, nutrient depletion, and things like that as possible microscopic models that can give me lambda and Xi and things of that sort. But this talk is a scenic detour. I don't want to do field theory. I don't feel like it. And at the moment, I don't care if you all think I'm an idiot. So I just want to tell you, a qualitative story. And in my qualitative story, I'm going to turn my StatMech brain off and tell my story as if I only know mechanics. So what I have is I have active particles, and these active particles are exerting forces either on each other, on the boundary, wherever, and that I call the active stress. And force balance has to tell me that there is a reaction stress that comes from either excluded volume interactions or deformability of the boundary or some other such thing, hydrodynamics, viscosity, whatever. These two have to balance. And I want to just play around with these two, the left-hand side and the right-hand side of this equation, and see if I can get self-limited structures. So that's my goal. And I tend to worry about why am I doing what I'm doing from the point of view of the taxpayer who funds my research. And when I do feel guilty, then I console myself by watching movies such as this. I want to make these things out of active matter. I want a bag that will crawl where I tell it to crawl. I want this movie is not playing. I want a bag that shape transforms in bizarre ways. And to get to this, what we want function. What we have is simple microscopic engines, and physical laws are the agents of cooperation. There are no rules. Momentum conservation and things like that are where the cooperation comes from. And I want a specific function. And for the purposes of today's talk, I will phrase my story in the context of two functions: motility, the top guy, and shape transformation, the bottom guy. Okay. Those are all big picture remarks. Now let's transition to the first part of my story, which is self-propelled rods under deformable confinement. So within my active stress, passive stress paradigm, my active stress is going to come from self-propelled particles undergoing overdamped dynamics. They may be spheres, they may be rigid rods, they may be semi-flexible polymers. And they all have a self-replenishing velocity along one axis of their body. Basically, I have a particle that moves along a direction u hat with a velocity v0, but the direction meanders in space with some white noise. That's the basic entity that's going to generate active stress. For the passive stress, I already have the excluded volume interactions between these guys. I want to exert active stress, but the other guy's body does not want me to come into him, and there's going to be a reaction stress. But in addition to that, I also now have deformable boundaries. I'm going to put them inside 2D semi-flexible rings, which are basically ball spring polymers with angle potentials that give them semi-flexibility. Or I put them inside balls that are 3D triangulated meshes, which are again ball spring membranes with dihedral potentials that give them characteristic bending moduli. So those are the circumstances I want to consider. And the story 1 has 2 parts. 1A, let me start by telling you the 2D version, rods in a rubber band. And the function that I'll focus on in this part of the story is transport. And let's start with a visual summary of what's happening. This is just 3 simulations, few rods inside rubber bands. The only thing that's changing as you go from the left to the right is the stiffness of the rubber band. Everything else is held fixed. The activity is fixed, the rod properties are fixed, and so on. And what these movies would have told you already is there is a different organization of the active particles based on the stiffness of the boundary. And the vesicle as a whole is diffusing or doing something. Under some circumstances, it acts as a persistent random walker. And for the moment, that is the next 3 slides, I will focus on the diffusion of the center of mass of the rubber band. That will be the only metric that I will show you any data for, and try to tell you how that behaves as a function of all of the zoo of parameters I could change here. I could change the stiffness of my rubber band, I could change the number of rods I put inside, I can change their activity, etc. And I'll tell you what diffusion does. Okay, let's establish our priors first. What do we already know? As I told you, I have active particles. They will accumulate at walls as long as the box is small enough. And they will be more dense in regions of high curvature because of this little story I told you, namely that the number of local normals will control the density at any region. But now I have a deformable boundary. So what I should expect is that once the cluster forms, it will deform the boundary where the cluster is. Because it's deforming the boundary, the radius of curvature will increase. I'll end up recruiting more people. So I would expect a feedback loop between this clustering in regions of high curvature and deformability. Yes, Alex?
Can the swimmers who have long protrusion out of the membrane?
In the regime in which I am sitting, they won't. My membrane is too stiff. But if I did a face field membrane or some other floppier thing, then they can. Yeah. In the story that I'm telling you, it's like really rubber band. You'll break it before you can do anything like that to it. Okay. So I would expect this to happen, and this was the reason Alexander asked me that question is because if this feedback mechanism is true, then you should start sticking out fingers in your membrane, right? And basically, I'm sitting in a region of parameter space where it cannot stick out fingers. But I should expect that I will have larger, longer-lived clusters as the boundary becomes softer. And I should also expect that the diffusion coefficient goes up. There are more of them pushing in one region than the other, so I would expect the diffusion to be more persistent and the diffusion coefficient goes up. So these are the priors that I know from all of the active matter literature I have read. And so then I go look at my data after I establish my priors. And for rods of aspect ratio up to 5, this is what the diffusion coefficient looks like as I change the stiffness of my rubber band. And the first thing I want to notice is that maybe I'm stupid because for the sphere and for the short rod, I don't see any stiffness dependence on the diffusion coefficient. I'm tempted to make a remark for the young people, which I usually do in my class, where he said that I am being stupid here and I feel stupid 10 times a day. All that happens with age is that you get used to it. You're like, yeah, I'm stupid. The frequency of stupidity doesn't appear to change at all. So what I'm finding is no stiffness dependence at all, and I'm wondering if I've been stupid, and I've been stupid but not actually very seriously, because active forces cannot be realigned if you're dealing with spheres. You need torque to be able to turn the rod at the wall, and if you can't turn the particle, then the diffusion coefficient cannot change, because if you start with an isotropic distribution of active forces, the net force on the object is not going to change. Your initial distribution is going to determine what the net force is. And you can verify this by looking at trajectories of different stiffness vesicles that have been initialized with the same initial condition for the active particles inside. The trajectory doesn't care what the stiffness of the vesicle is or what the details are. So the very low aspect ratio cases don't belong in my picture for enhancement of diffusion, because the walls cannot realign particles. But at intermediate aspect ratios, I do see the feature that I was expecting, that the softer the vesicle, the more the diffusion coefficient would be. So that part's okay. But then I go to longer aspect ratios and something else happens. I find a Goldilocks stiffness at which there is enormous enhancement of diffusion coefficient. If you compare the y-axis of the two plots, one runs up to 2.5 and the other is at 80. Right? So they are all in the same units. So it's a very large enhancement of the diffusion at some Goldilocks stiffness. And so now we just try to understand this Goldilocks stiffness. And the answer is in the movie. So if you just look at the movie, the middle guy is the one that's is the Goldilocks stiffness rubber band. And what you will see is, in a few seconds, is the emergence of a long-lived single cluster state that basically just pushes that thing along. So the long-lived state in that system is this single cluster that goes and forms in one region. So then I want to ask myself, how do I understand the emergence of the single cluster? And I start by saying, okay, I have one rod and it runs into a wall. If the rod is self-propelled and it runs into a wall, what it will do is become parallel to the wall. Right? You run into the wall, where you're running in won't change, so you will torque yourself. This point will be the lever, you'll torque yourself into the wall. So a single active particle at the wall will become parallel to the wall. But if two guys meet at the wall and they run into each other, then they'll stand up and push into the wall. If two self-propelled particles come together, they become parallel and go this way. Now here two self-propelled particles are coming together like this at the wall. There is no place to go but to do this. So they'll line up. And what you can think of, just for a cartoon, again suppressing all math, I don't want to show you collision frequencies for hard rods. It's like an effective attractive interaction between self-propelled rods that scales with the activity. And then, okay, so now they form, and then another couple of guys come and they join the cluster and so on, and they go on doing this. And as they accumulate, they deform the membrane a little bit more, make a little bit more room for a couple more guys to join, and so on. But at some point, this will stop because the membrane will say enough is enough, don't push back on me. So there will be some angle theta beyond which this membrane will start resisting this deformation and thereby prevent more rods from joining my cluster. So you can estimate when this happens, and when this happens and when every rod inside my membrane is sitting there, that's my single cluster state. And so you can do this calculation. The math is there in this paper. You get some answer for what the Goldilocks stiffness should be as a function of activity and the number of rods. And then you go back to your simulation, vary stiffness, vary active forces, and so on, and it kind of sort of works. I'm saying kind of sort of works because it's n to the 5 and I have probed up to 80 number of rods. It doesn't mean anything. I could have drawn any line there. So I don't like this because I could not verify my theoretical conclusion in these simulations. So I want to change gears where I can validate this theoretical conclusion a little better. And I want to talk about the second part of my first story, which is the same thing, rods in a rubber band, but now in 3D. So I have a vesicle and then I have rods inside them. Okay. The 2D is easy to visualize because you're looking at cartoons that are in plane. I will use the same cartoons to tell my 3D story, but now it's going to be in 3D. The roadmap is the following. I consider a 3D elastic vesicle. I sit on the center of mass frame. Everything that I will show you, I'm going to remove all the information about wherever it's moving as a vesicle. And I'm going to characterize the shape of the vesicle as a function of parameters. So my goal now is like, I don't care about the diffusion. I don't care about the center of mass motion of the vesicle. I'm only going to focus on the shape of the vesicle. Because the center of mass motion will automatically come out of the stuff that I will tell you in a minute. Now that it's coming out of my mouth, I realize I didn't prime it right. And for the purposes of today, I will focus on only two parameters that I can change in the system. The aspect ratio of my filament, namely my rod can be short or very long, and the packing fraction, how many of them I decide to put inside my vesicle. Those are the only two parameters that I'm going to talk about today. And of course, you can change everything else. Filament, how stiff is the filament, what is the activity, what is the vesicle elasticity, and so on. And we have done all of those things as well. But, okay. Again, let's start with a visual summary. The volume fraction, how many rods I put inside the bag, is on the x-axis. The aspect ratio, namely how long are the rods, are on the y-axis. And for the simulation people, the specific parameters used are in this little text box here. But I want to point out two things for you to notice. I have this oblate deformed ring-like state, and I have this prolate deformed cap-like states. Those are the two features I want to point out of this movie. Now let's talk about the phase diagram a little bit more slowly. Again, this is the same phase diagram, but instead of movies, I'm just showing you data points. And what I point out is that I have a bunch of states that I don't have any robust characterization for, and they don't give rise to any shape transformations that are interesting. The thing stays spherical, fluctuates very little, and what's happening inside it is either transient banding of some sort, or there is some flocking, and there's all kinds of stuff that's like very highly fluctuating that I don't have a good statistical description for. And then I have these open circle states, which I call polar rings. It's one stream of these self-propelled rods sitting on one great circle on my vesicle and deforming the vesicle in that great circle so that the vesicle becomes more pancake-like. That's the state that is. So you have all of these guys cluster. They form one stream of polar guys chasing each other, and that great circle deforms. So you get a pancake. And the other are these things that we call capped states, where you get states that have a single cap, states that have two caps, states that have three caps, and so on. And they just change as I change volume fraction and aspect ratio. The colors on this phase diagram are visual indications of where in parameter space these things are happening. Okay, now let me talk about the ring state. The ring state, this is just a movie where the top, everything is the same between the top movie and the bottom movie, except that the top movie, the vesicle is rigid. It's not allowed to deform, while in the bottom movie, the vesicle is allowed to deform. And what I want to point out here is that while I get the ring state in the bottom movies, I don't get it in the top movies. I get a ring-like thing and then it falls apart and then forms in a different direction and so on. It doesn't stay put. So for sure, I need deformability and I need long filaments for this state to exist. The mathematical story turns out to be the following. As we know, if you put self-propelled particles with polar interactions on a sphere, which is basically take Toner 2 equations and put them on a sphere, then there exists a topologically protected state where you have a polar band going around a great circle, right? And I encourage you to ask Suraj or Christina about this work. What happens, it turns out, is that if your self-propelled particles were not interacting in a polar way, but were instead interacting in a nematic way, which is what happens for particles with excluded volume interactions, the topological protection goes away. The thing becomes unstable to undulation. When you put a self-propelled nematic on a sphere, the band becomes unstable to undulations. And because it becomes unstable to undulations, it falls apart and then reforms in some other direction. But if my vesicle is deformable, it seems to live for long because it basically makes a hole for itself into the deformable vesicle and they suppresses the undulations. So this is a linear stability analysis that I have not written up, and I don't think I will, so I encourage you to do it. It's actually very straightforward. Take Suraj's paper, change the equations, the answer comes out. All right, then I want to tell you about capped states. I thought these were movies.
Beyond the linear stability plus everything, is there an easier way to see why like you get undulation and so you get a does it falls back because it becomes elliptic, or is this
No, so the polar band forms, but by the time the polar band is finished forming, it's already deformed and it's in a furrow. So there are no undulations. The undulations are prevented by the elasticity of the membrane. If I make my membrane floppy, then the undulations become important, as has been seen in the experiments with Bausch and company on their GUV thing. So yeah, that's basically it. It's just suppressing the elasticity, suppressing the undulation. Yeah, so in these three movies, I thought they were all movies, but let me see. Yeah, so in these three movies, what's happening is I'm only changing the number of rods in my system. Everything else is fixed. Activity, stiffness. Oh, I guess the 3-cap state is from a different one. But if I had put the right movie here, I would have changed nothing but the number of rods as I go from this to that and nothing else. And I would be able to go from 1 caps to 2 cap to 3 cap. That's my self-limited structure. If I put more rods, I don't have more rods joining the same cluster. They go from another cluster in which they can live. Right? This cluster has a size. You can't add any more to that. If you add more guys into the vesicle, they'll go form a different cap. So this cap is a self-limited structure in that sense. And the cap size is independent of the total number of rods in the vesicle, and the basic mechanism is the same as what I told you before, namely that this slide is about something else. All right, first let's talk about, I have rods inside a vesicle. If they are self-propelled enough and the vesicle is small enough, they'll end up being at the wall, and they could be at the wall parallel to the wall, and may not talk to each other at all if you have very few rods. But if you have enough rods, the parallel rods that are already aligned at the wall can collide. And if they collide, they will stand up, but they can stand up in plane now, right? Because there is another direction. I'm in 2D, so I could collide this way and stand up, but this could still be in the plane of my vesicle. So when the collisions start happening, I get both polar rings and capped states. And I can estimate where this would happen by saying that the reorientation time must be related to the self-propulsion velocity and the aspect ratio. And similarly, the collision time should be related to the self-propulsion velocity and the packing fraction. So if I estimate the reorientation time as, oh yeah, it has to go as 1 over the, it must basically be the aspect ratio divided by the self-propulsion velocity. And I estimate the collision frequency by saying it has to be the self-propulsion velocity times the packing fraction. Then the self-propulsion velocity drops out of it and I get a prediction for when this should happen as a function of just aspect ratio and packing fraction. And that dashed line is the one that comes from this calculation, and it's reasonably predictive of when these collective states are originated. And if you go look at it in the activity volume fraction plane, then you can see that the onset is independent of activity, exactly like the scaling analysis would predict. And I repeat the calculation that I described earlier. Some of it is in this old paper, but the rest of it is not written up yet. But I can repeat this calculation and get a number of predictions associated with what this cap, how many rods would be in the cap, how does it scale with the stiffness and things like that. And at the end of the day, what you can get is, if you tell me the packing fraction of rods in the vesicle, I can tell you the number of caps that it would form. It would be a function of the aspect ratio, and that A star guy is where the entire mess is. A star is a complicated function of vesicle stiffness, rod stiffness, and things like that. And this theoretical estimate is not terrible. So this is an analysis of the number of caps as a function of this cooked up parameter that turns out to depend on over many simulations. And it works for simulations where the number of caps is not too high. But when the number of caps become very high, this prediction is all wrong. And I don't know why it's all wrong, but my guess is that we are not counting the caps correctly. The caps are moving around a lot when there are many caps, and my cap detection thing is probably not distinguishing the caps correctly here. It's making mistakes, the number of caps are changing or something like that. This is something that I haven't looked into to understand yet. Okay, that brings me to the end of my first story. I showed the work of two graduate students, Sarvesh Uplap and Matt Peterson, and this work was done in collaboration with my partner in crime, Mike Hagen. Before I transition to the second story, comments or questions about the first story? Yes, Suraj.
The polar band thing that you showed, there were also oscillations of the vesicle, or was I hallucinating?
There can be. So not in the parameter region I showed you, but if I had a softer vesicle, then there can be oscillations, because in the softer vesicle, the undulation starts but doesn't grow. So you can look like breathing.
No, but also like it seemed like the vesicle was, it was not just global oscillations, but there were local sort of wave like.
Oh, there are, yes. There's all kinds of local stuff that's happening. We didn't analyze it with these polar rods, but we did analyze it with pneumatic rods, the ones that go back and forth. And in that case, you have, it's a mess. So some low-hanging summary of it is that it seems like you won't get the normal Helfrich-like spectrum for the fluctuations, and there is some non-trivial cross-correlation between what the rods are doing and what the membrane is doing. So there's something interesting there. But I don't know what happens for the polar rods. I have data. If you want to analyze it, I'll give it to you. Sriram, then Ananyu.
Maybe he's saying the same things. Go ahead.
Okay. Age before beauty. Forget him. Tell me.
So, a polar rods hitting on a membrane, you can have the wave version of the pump, clump thing. It's just pumps on the membrane.
Yes. Oh, I don't have any hydrodynamics.
You don't need hydrodynamics. You just need, you mentioned your conserved density, but even if you don't have that, you have something with pushing like this.
Yes.
It's recruiting other guys.
Yes.
That gives you an instability, and the fact that it's pushing like this, it gives you density. In the density equation, you have a term which is del T of psi.
Okay.
Is divergence of psi grad H.
Okay.
So in a state with which there is an average psi.
Okay.
That's a del squared H.
Okay.
And del TH is just psi.
Okay.
That gives you a wave.
Okay, so this is about traveling waves along the membrane. Yes, that is true. And since this simulation will never get there, so you need a different microscopic model than that. But I agree with you. I just can't find it in this particular microscopic model because it's not in the right parameter regime. Alexander, then
No,
Sheena.
I was more or less saying what Ananya was saying.
Okay.
This is closely related to the waves on active membrane.
Okay, yes.
Well, kind of feel already along the same
Yes.
theme. If you add fluids to
Yes, yes.
the whole thing wouldn't diffuse around, would it?
There'll be all kinds of other stuff that happens. So I haven't done this with fluids in it for these particle-based like things. I've done it with fluids in them where I put active pneumatic inside and normal fluid outside and stuff like that. Then it does very complicated things.
No, but would the center of mass diffuse around?
It does diffuse around a little bit, not very diffusive. It's just randomly jiggling around. It doesn't have persistent motion if it is large enough. If it is small enough, I've only put active pneumatics inside them, so I don't actually know.
But this would require the velocity field at the surface of your cluster, so you need to get coupling to the outside world.
Oh, it's just hydrodynamic coupling. There is no slip boundary conditions from a fluid on both sides, right? And there's an immersed boundary in between that keeps track of what is happening.
Okay, maybe I'll ask you later.
Yes, and I'm happy to show you those.
Usually if I throw a box around it, I'm not applying any force to it, so I cannot move the center of mass.
Yes, that is on average true. But it does fluctuate a little bit, and the fluctuation comes because of the net force is zero, but the force dipole is not always zero. There's some distribution of forces that you can have, and that causes deformations and jiggling and things like that.
Well, I'll
Yes, I will show you movies. Yes. Okay, I answered that question unsatisfactorily, and now I'm feeling a little, whatever, not so good feelings. Now I want to transition for the last 10 minutes. Oh, I don't have 10 minutes, do I?
You have including questions.
Okay, I will rush through this last part by just showing you some movies. This does not have students involved in it yet. It's just me playing with experimental data from these three people. Zvonimir Dojic, who's at UCSB, Seth Frieden at Brandeis, and Guillaume Duclos at Brandeis. So I'm just going to show you experimental data and some beginning stages of trying to understand what's happening here. This is my quest to make self-limited assembly in active systems. But this is funded by our group grant, the MERSEC. And the way I think about what I do with this group grant is, our philosophy is that what I can't create, I can't understand. So don't build some fancy theory up in the lab, unless it's up in the theory offices. Unless it works in the cup, it doesn't count. So I'm going to only show you the stuff that works in the cup. So the system is microtubules and kinesin. And even though the first work that studied microtubule and kinesin showed asters, most of our time in studying these systems has been spent in regimes where it either forms an extensile active fluid. If it is on an interface, then it's a 2D pneumatic. And at other times, it forms a globally contracting gel. So those are the regimes that we've looked at carefully. So we decided to go back and look at if asters could be this candidate that I'm looking for self-limited structures that can lead to function. The basic ingredients of the system are there are microtubules. For our purposes, they are rods of some length L that have a plus end and a minus end, a head and a tail. There are kinesin motor clusters. These are kinesin 1 motor clusters that have been modified with a biotin streptavidin tag and all kinds of other biochemistry magic, but they have these legs and they can walk on the microtubules. And then there is a depletant that tends to bundle these guys together. The depletant in this data that I'll show you is PEG. So those are the ingredients. And what usually happens when you put these things in a cup without thinking too much about what you put and how much of it you put, it does this, the sloshing about that we all know and love that has been called the isotropic active gel. And sometimes, nobody knew why, they formed asters. The exact same thing. You put the same things in the cup and you were expecting to see the extensile active fluid and you see asters. And so we decided to look at this a little carefully. And what Guillaume's student Najma did was do a whole series of experiments in which she characterized what happens as a function of ATP concentration and motor cluster concentration and demarcated the regime where you get the normal extensile fluid that we used to get, and the region in which you get asters, and the region in which you get global contraction. Same microscopic ingredients, very different organization of the material in my fluid. So I want to focus on the aster phase. There are a lot of things here that we understand, but for the aster phase, I want to notice two experimental facts. The motors are end accumulating. So we know that because there is 3D confocal reconstruction where the motors are seen in yellow and they are all in the middle of the aster. And we also know that the motors are end accumulating because we've done experiments where we put these things on a cover slip and watch the microtubules are stuck on the cover slip, and the bright green spots are the ones where the motors are accumulating, and you can see them accumulate at the ends under the same circumstances in which we get asters. And we also know that we don't get asters if our motors are not precessive. It is possible for us to have motors that will still exert forces on the microtubules and push them around, but they don't walk on the microtubule. And this walking on the microtubule turns out to be important for asters. And the simple picture that we developed was to say that, okay, these motors are end accumulating. And if I have end accumulated motors, it's like having rods that are sticky at one end. And if I have rods that are sticky at one end, they would cluster, and that cluster would be like an aster. That's one part of the story. And the other part of the story is to say when there is enough PEG, where the entropy maximization basically says that these rods have to be parallel to each other in order to allow PEG as much room as it wants to wander around. When the alignment interaction wins, you should be able to align them parallel and thereby get bundles. So this is the naive theoretical model. And this naive theoretical model, there's no activity here. I'm doing equilibrium like, oh, this is energy, this is entropy type storytelling. And yes.
Once I'll ask an experimental question.
Yes.
Are these motors, these are what? These are just kinesin motors, but all are they tied? Are there a pair of kinesin motors tied together?
Oh, there are 4 kinesin motors on biotin streptavidin tags. There's a biotin streptavidin tag, there is a biotin in the middle, and each of these motors has a streptavidin tag.
Okay,
So they form a motor cluster of 4. 4 is the guess, or 4 is the ideal. When they actually prepare it, you don't know how many they have.
because Andrea, stars, etc., they use 2, I think.
Yeah, that's the non-precessive. And the non-precessive with light is like beautiful. It does its job and falls apart. Yeah. So I don't have non-precessive data in this talk, but we have that too. And actually what Torres has is also the... Oh, by the way, if you want to do experiments, or if you know somebody whose life you want to ruin and they should do these experiments, we're happy to give you purified proteins. Anything I have, you can have. You just have to get in touch with us. We'll ship you purified proteins, and we have a drug dealer approach. First taste is free. First... okay, so now I take the story where alignment wins and I get bundles, and stickiness wins and I get asters, and I try to see, okay, how do I transform this story into something that is in terms of stuff I put inside the cup. And I come up with a story that, okay, I can think of the strength of the alignment as scaling linearly with the concentration of PEG and quadratically with the concentration of microtubules. And I can think of this end stickiness as scaling with the number of bound motor clusters per microtubule and the probability that 2 microtubules come together. So that's the relationship that I come up with in terms of stuff that I'm putting in the cup. When I talk to my experimentalists, I have to tell them what is the concentration of PEG they should put and what is the concentration of motor proteins they should put. If I tell them anything else, they stop listening to me. So, and this bound motor cluster is just Michaelis-Menten kinetics to find the number of motor clusters that are likely to be bound for a given concentration of motor clusters in solution. And you can get the off-rate constants from biochemistry literature. So I have a quote-unquote theory which predicts a transition in the ATP motor concentration plane as a straight line, where the straight line slope is determined by the PEG concentration. There is still one fit parameter here, and you use that fit parameter and draw this line. This is called drawing the line. This is not fitting the line. You just move the parameter around till it sits where it needs to sit. So you do that. But then if this thing has any value, I should stop fitting anything, take the same line and use it in a different experiment and come up with the same answer. And we do that by comparing it in a different experiment where you're varying peg and motor cluster concentration, and the line works. So this kind of a thing works. I'm going to stop talking because my chair is up, but I'll skip this and show just one movie. This is the data I'm sitting on, where we are making asters. We have better control over the shape and everything with actin. And we have all kinds of confocal imaging and so on. And it's going to be cool when I understand anything. Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Thanks a lot, Aparna, for the wonderful talk. Time for questions.
Can you tell us about this last thing?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so the idea that we had, one of the things that I didn't tell you is that, oh yeah, I can understand how to make asters and stuff like that, but I don't have any control. They form in whatever size they form, and they sometimes coarsen, sometimes they belt. There's no control. So we thought we'll get control by changing the passive stress and by adding actin into my system. Actin is passive. All it's going to do is act as a polymer that is sitting around in the fluid, and only the microtubules are active, and they're active in a way we understand. So we thought we'll do this, and it turned out to give better size control over the aster. It doesn't give lifetime control. You get better asters that are size controlled. And the reason it turns out that these asters are somewhat size controlled is because the aster core has all of the actin sitting in it. The microtubule pushes the actin and compactifies it into one big ball, and all of the actin is sitting in the core. These are two color images where the magenta is the microtubule and the green is the actin. It's all sitting in the core. And the size of the core seems to be determined by how much actin you put inside the system. So we're fiddling around with this to try to see if we can get better control. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you. Other comments? Yes.
So, what is the kind of abundance of the motors in the system? In other words, if you look at the microtubules, at the single one in equilibrium, how much of this is covered by a kind of traffic jam of motors at the end?
Okay. So I don't actually know the answer to the question, but the best guess may be based on these single filament assays where you can watch what's happening is like less than 10% of the microtubule tip is decorated with motors.
Do you know whether this is a sensitive control parameter?
It's not a control parameter in the experiment at all, because there is very little that they can do with motors, but it is a control parameter in a computer simulation, right? So this, oh no, not this one. Where is the simulation? Okay, I will play this and stop talking. But I don't know the answer to your question, but the computer simulation does indeed, it doesn't want me to play it.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking, we had what we very unfortunately called an active model C some time ago.
Okay, SMACTIC.
Which shows very similar formation of a
blobby aster.
Of blobby asters moving around randomly, but that happened in a very specific part of the parameter space where only a part of microtubules was dressed with motors.
Okay.
So it would be interesting to know whether this is even close to where you are experimenting.
Yes, so at the moment I don't know the answers, but we can play around with the computer simulation and so on, and we are in the regime where only the motors are mostly at one end of the microtubules and they're just getting zipped around, but I have no way of testing it in reality yet.
If you have now those data and you have the motors and the tubes, etc., how would you then turn this into some kind of mechanistic model?
So this is the mechanistic model, so to speak, where what I can control is the binding rate of the motor and the precession rate of the motor and the off rate of the motor. And what the experiment also has is some non-specific clustering that happens in certain kinds of kinesin and other kinesins where there is no non-specific clustering. So you can add an attractive interaction between the motors or turn them off and see if you can reproduce the phenomenology as a function of motor concentration given precession rate and and binding affinities inferred from the single filament acid. That's my hope. I don't know if this hope is going to be validated or not, but we have a pile of data and we're playing with it, and maybe.
Okay, I see no more questions. Aparna, thanks again.